Hello everybody, it's Milan from New Venture Software, and today I would like to talk to you about a little known feature of Azure called resource policies. But before I go into the details of what resource policies are, I would like to first talk about common problems that come up once you start using the cloud more heavily. So here I've listed a couple of those issues that I've encountered, and I'm sure that many of you have encountered them as well. So once you start using the cloud more heavily, problems like how do we name our resources appear. If you have like 200 resources, maybe you want to impose some kind of structure on the naming. You don't want just random names there. Another big issue, of course, is tracking spending. One way that you can track spending more easily and in more detail with Azure is to assign different tags to your resources. For example, if you have different cost centers, you can easily assign tags to your resources that specify the cost center that each resource is attached to. So how do you enforce that the person or the script will indeed put those tags in place? Another common problem is that you might deploy the wrong kind of tiers of your resources. For example, let's say that I need a certain tier of SQL resources, but by mistake, a script or a person creates a tier that's twice as expensive. All these problems can be tackled by using resource policies, and I'm sure that you can come up with more problems and issues that can be covered by resource policies by the end of this talk. Another topic that I think is very important for understanding how resource policies work is actually understanding the process of creating new resources. What happens when you click create in the portal or you run a PowerShell script? So whenever we click create in the portal, what I call a deployment request is created. You're basically asking Azure, all right, I want this resource created. Could you please do that? And behind the scenes, your request for a resource is described in the so-called deployment template. And this deployment template is a JSON file that describes all of the properties and the settings of the resource that you want to create. Of course, this is a little bit more complicated, but let's now keep it simple. And just remember that there is this JSON that describes the resource that you would like to create. So if you take a look here at this JSON, you can find several interesting properties. First one is this kind property that specifies that this should actually be a web app. Another one that you should be able to easily identify is actually the location. The location property is the data center that you've chosen for this particular resource. And in this example, we have West Europe as a data center. We can also see other properties related to the compute that should be used for our app. And of course, in real scenarios, these deployment template files are quite large. So this is just a subset of the property that you usually have, but it illustrates how everything works. So we've clicked create in the portal. Our deployment template describing our resource has been created. And what happens next is that if there are any resource policies defined, they will be evaluated. And you can think of the Azure policies as a validations over the deployment template for our resource. And so if the policies and the conditions in there are satisfied, our resource will be created. If the conditions are not met, the policy is not satisfied, deployment will be rejected. So if we go back to the deployment template, I just want to reiterate that you can think of the resource policies as validations over this deployment template. And what we can do with resource policies is say, all right, there's this location property here. I want to check and verify that the location property can only be West Europe. And if it's not, I want the request for deployment to fail. Okay, I'm sure that you're now eager to find out how resource policies look like. And I'm probably sure that it's not going to be a surprise that the resource policies themselves are in JSON. So we've got the deployment template, which is JSON, and now we have a resource policy, which is another JSON. And there are many properties in the resource policy definition, but the most important one for sure is the so-called policy rule. This property policy rule contains all of the criteria, all of the conditions that you want to be observed whenever a resource is being created or being requested rather. And we are going to focus on this policy rule. Okay, so let's take a closer look. I've extracted the policy rule so that we are not bothered by the other details. And let's now take a look at the schema of the policy rule. All right. So a policy rule has an if property and a then property. So the then specifies what happens whenever the if is true, and there are many effects that you can choose. For today, we're going to focus on the denial one, and it actually allows you to cancel a deployment request whenever your conditions are not met. Now, the if statement or if property itself can contain conditions and logical operators. So let's now focus on conditions. Conditions are basically a pair of a field and a criteria. So another important thing to mention about conditions is that they return either true or false. If we go back to our example of a policy rule, we can very easily identify the condition here. We have a pair of a field and a criteria. Here the field is called location, and our criteria contains some allowed values for our field. So we can choose to use many kinds of fields. We can pretty much choose and work with any of the properties in our deployment template. And here I've listed some of the fields that we can use. We can use the name of the resource. We can check the kind of the resource. We can check the type, the location. We can check whether some tags are applied. And we can use also the so-called property aliases. And for now, you can think about property aliases just as a name of a property. All right. Moving on to criterias. So here I've listed the criteria that can be used. We can use equals to check whether a field has specific value. We can use like and match to form patterns. We can use contains to check whether something is contained within a property value. The in allows us to check whether a field belongs to a specific set of values. We can use contains key, of course, to check for keys. Exist allows us to check whether a field exists. All right, so we now know what conditions are. Let's now see how we can use conditions to check or impose some kind of restrictions on the resources that are being created. So we're looking at one deployment template that we've already seen. Let's imagine that we want to restrict the location of our resources to be only in Australia. So a condition that can do that for us is this one. Again, we've got the field at the top saying, all right, I want to check the location field. So whenever our resource policy runs and this condition is evaluated, it's basically saying, all right, I want to work with this guy here, the location, and the criteria here you actually test the value of the location and whether this value is Australia East or Australia Southeast. So in this case, with this deployment template, our condition will return false. All right, so let's now take a look at a couple of examples of other conditions. Here, the first one, we are checking whether the SQL name of a virtual machine exists. You'll see later on why this is important, but many times you want to check if some kind of property exists. Moving on, here we have again the location. We've already seen this, and in this instance we want to check whether the location is either US East or North Europe. We have a field called enable file encryption, and you want to make sure that it is actually true. We can do that using the equals criteria. And just an example here, we are checking the type and we're using the like condition, which allows us to create patterns. So basically this one will match everything under that begins with any type that begins with Microsoft.compute virtual machine scale set. Okay, now let's focus our attention on the logical operators. What logical operators allow us to do is precisely define the condition and the definition and the criteria that we want for our resources. Also, they allow us to create complex, of course, hierarchies of conditions. They allow us to combine multiple conditions. And these are the three logical operators that are available. We've got the not operator, which simply reverses the result of a condition. We have the OF operator, which requires that all conditions are true or are met, and any of requires one or more conditions to be true. All right, so we now know about all of the building blocks of a policy rule. And let's now try and dissect a policy rule that achieves a specific goal. Imagine that you have a resource group, and this resource group can contain all kinds of resources, but you want to make sure that the virtual machines that are created in this resource group can only have SKU basic A0 or basic A1. If you're not familiar with the SKUs are basically the tiers of the virtual machines, and the SKU specifies how powerful your machine is. So first, let's take a look at the effect of our policy rule, and the effect is deny. It basically says, all right, if the if is true, let's deny requests. Okay, simple as that. Now this policy rule now contains two conditions. And as I've mentioned, we use logical operators to be able to combine different conditions. And in this case, we use the OF, which requires all conditions to be true. Now, the first condition here at the top basically checks whether Microsoft.compute virtual machine SQL name field exists. Since we only want to check whether virtual machines have a specific SQL, we do not care about any other resources. We do a check whether the deployment template is actually for a virtual machine. And there are a couple of ways to do that. One way is to simply check whether this property exists, and resources that are not virtual machines won't have this property. All right. I have said that you want to restrict the SQ or the tier of the virtual machine. So again, we check the property that specifies the SQ. Here it is. And we simply use an in condition to restrict this property or field to basic A0 or A1. So that's it. That's a policy rule that can check whether a virtual machine has a specific SQ. Now, the only thing left to do is actually apply this policy rule. So let me open the portal. Here I have defined a resource group. Let's see how we can apply a certain resource policy here. Now you can find the policies here on the tabs on the left, and of course you can simply search for policy and it will appear. So we just simply click on policies and click add. So the folks at Microsoft have created the so-called default policies that you can very easily with a couple of clicks apply. And for example, let's say that we want to restrict the locations of the resources that are being created, and I simply choose allowed locations from the dropdown. And then I have to choose my resources. So let's say that I want the resource to be only deployed in Australia. I select the Australia data centers and come up with some kind of a name for an ID for my policy and simply click OK. And that's it. In the cases where you have to deal with simple common resource policies, you don't have to think about JSON or whatnot, which is great. And now this policy is in place, and if I try to create a resource that is not in Australia, it will fail. But let's also take a look at how we can assign and create your custom policy. Now this policy that I have here is the same policy rule that we just saw on the presentation. It will restrict virtual machines SQs to basic A0 and basic A1. So how can we apply this policy rule? It's very easy. I'm going to show you how you can do it using PowerShell, but it's very similar for other environments. So what we do is simply create a policy definition using the rules specified in our JSON file. We get a reference to the resource group that we need to apply this to. And the final step is to actually apply, or the term is assign this policy to a resource group or a subscription. So if I pull up PowerShell here and execute this script to run successfully, and if I go back to the portal and refresh it, we should see the second policy being applied here. And as you can see, we've got our initial locations policy and our new one, the latest one that we've just applied. Let's try to create a storage account that's not in Australia. Let's create some kind of name, dummy name. I want that in my policy resource group, and let's try to create it in North Europe. If I click create, the policy will be evaluated, or rather the two policies that we have. And as you can see, we get an error saying that, all right, such and such policy does not allow this resource to be created. I hope that this information was helpful. Thank you so much for your attention. Till next time. Bye bye.